Today I want to talk about the concept of sacrifice. Sacrifice is one of the more challenging messages of the Easter season. Giving one's life out of love for someone else is one of the most extreme examples of sacrifice. But it's not the only kind. Less extreme examples of sacrifice are common within most spiritual traditions to this day. For example, Lent, the time period leading up to Easter, is often seen as a time of self-sacrifice for the good of others. Jesus, both in his teachings and in his death, demonstrate a morality and ethic of sacrifice. In prayer and meditation, in our worship services, we sacrifice our time and our energy. Time and energy that could be used for other things in order that we can grow closer to God. There is a connection between self-giving sacrifice and spirituality, or closeness to God. Throughout time, dating back to prehistory, humankind has asked God or the gods, "What do you want?" And time and again, the answer humans have heard is one of sacrifice. Even the pagan gods required sacrifice. As if the message from God all along was, don't be so selfish. Give of yourself to others. A simple message that we hear in funny ways. And thousands of years ago, giving of ourselves or sacrifice was understood as giving our most important things to God directly, mostly in kind of external ways. Before the advent of agriculture, meat was by far humanity's most important and valuable possession. So meat from wild animals became the subject of sacrifice in people's individual lives and in ancient religious ceremonies. This practice is incredibly widespread across very different cultures around the world. Meat was a gift from God, and so it was natural for humans to expect that gods would need or want meat just like humans. The practice of animal sacrifice continued for thousands, uncounted years, with the human spiritual need to sacrifice or to give of ourselves ritualized into animal sacrifice, the sacrifice of our most valuable resources to God. This kind of sacrifice was not always for others, except within those traditions that shared sacrificed meat with the poor and with those who were hungry. But animal sacrifice somehow helped ancient people grow closer to God in ways that are difficult for us to understand today. Which brings us to Easter. An important impact that Easter had, this new way of spirituality that Jesus offered, was it provided an end to that practice, an end to animal sacrifice. As Christianity grew in popularity and in power, animal sacrifice was left behind in the dust bin of history as human understandings of sacrifice took on new meanings. Jesus taught that sacrifice, to be effective, had to have a purpose other than just giving something up. Sacrificing your best food, meat, was less effective at bringing forgiveness and closeness to God as meat became plentiful and available to many people. Also, by Jesus' time, meat was no longer seen as the most important thing. Money and possessions had taken hold. So when Jesus asked someone to sacrifice of themselves, he's usually talking about money or possessions. Jesus said to the rich who wanted to grow closer to God, sacrifice your belongings. Not your best cow. Sacrifice your money. Sacrifice what is most important to you, your money and your possessions. And sacrifice them in a particular way by giving it to the poor, by giving it to those in greatest need. Jesus taught us to give up some of our plentiful resources so others don't suffer so much. Not to be burned in some kind of ritual sacrifice. No, but instead to be given on behalf of others, specifically for those who did not have enough to survive. At the time of Jesus' earthly ministry, animal sacrifice was everywhere. Both the Jews and the pagans practiced it extensively. So Jesus naturally talked about it. Jesus often talked about sacrifice in terms of sheep and the practices associated with raising and sacrificing sheep. Jesus used this ancient agricultural symbolism to teach us about sacrifice at a spiritual level, moving sacrifice from strictly an external act to something that's more holistic. Since few of us today are directly familiar with the practices of raising sheep for sacrifice, some of the agricultural symbolism can be difficult for us. And to make things even more challenging, Jesus identified himself. Sometimes, I'm the shepherd. Other times, I'm the sheep. Sometimes, I'm the sheep's gate. And just before today's reading, the sheep gate was mentioned just before Jesus says, I'm the shepherd. These analogies are designed for another people in a very different time whose life experiences were very different from ours. But we still carry much of the symbolism with us to a certain degree, particularly the image of Jesus as a shepherd, which is deeply embedded in Christian tradition, practices, and piety. In the Old Testament, the psalmist writes, the Lord is my shepherd. And the scripture passage we read today, I am the good shepherd, says Jesus. Now, the word translated as good when Jesus uses that sentence is actually closer to the English word model or example. So Jesus in the original text is saying, I'm the model shepherd, or I'm the ideal shepherd. Jesus is saying he's the best example of God's leadership. Or more generically, Jesus is the best example of God's teachings. God's teachings are exemplified by Jesus as the model shepherd. We are to sacrifice our money like a shepherd who sacrifices his time and his effort for the sheep. Jesus serves as a model showing us the best way to live and to act as examples of love. Notice that Jesus does not describe himself in this instance as a good king, but rather as a good shepherd. Even though Jesus talks about the kingdom of God, Jesus prefers the image of shepherding over the image of a powerful king when referring to himself. A shepherd leads in ways that are very different and distinct from a king. Shepherds lead with a light hand. A king commands with a heavy hand. A shepherd tends to their sheep, while a king lords over their subjects. The image of Jesus as a good shepherd is intensely relational. The concept of shepherd has no meaning without the presence of sheep. Jesus is the example, the model shepherd, not just because of his relationship to the sheep, but also his relationship to God. In Psalm 23, God assumes the duties of the shepherd, the one who leads, protects, and who seeks the lost sheep. In John 10, Jesus' analogy links himself with God's self-giving love as the shepherd of this world. Jesus says, as the good shepherd, he's willing to lay down his life for the sheep, willing to lay down his life to further God's purposes. This is an expression of extreme sacrifice, not just giving up a valuable possession. It's not just sacrifice for the sake of giving up something as a demonstration of discipline. It's sacrifice with a purpose. Jesus is willing to give his life in the same manner that a good shepherd would to protect his sheep. We often think about Jesus' sacrifice as an atonement for sin. But that's not its only meaning. It's not its only role. And what about the sheep? In these biblical farming analogies with Jesus as the shepherd, you know what that makes the rest of us, right? Yep, we're the sheep. Referring to people as sheep in our modern vernacular is generally a put down. It's a bad thing. But when it comes to our spiritual growth, we're supposed to approach God that way. Like sheep, innocent, ready to follow. This is really important. There is a sense of feeling, an attitude of surrender, of being a follower that's required to grow closer to God and to Christ and to Spirit. Because that kind of surrender is required to heal our selfish nature, sometimes referred to as our sinful nature. This kind of surrender is sometimes encapsulated by the simple prayer, "Not my will, but your will be done." That kind of surrender. Growing closer to God requires that we set aside our normal, selfish approach to the world and replace it with loving surrender. Loving surrender that impacts our entire being. Loving surrender that gives us a heart for the poor, for the rejected, for the left behind, for those that nobody else cares for. On the other hand, selfishness focuses on self rather than God. It is through deep surrender that we learn to hear Christ's voice, or that we experience the Spirit of God in clear and life-changing ways. Like sheep, we're going to get lost from time to time, and there's going to be the danger of wolves and other risks. Following the Good Shepherd as our example requires surrender, trust, and it requires the grace of God. Following Christ is a path of sacrifice as we sacrifice our own ways and seek Christ's ways. As we give up the ways of self-centeredness, of greed, of self-trust, and adopt the ways of unconditional love. The people living during Jesus' time would have known that the life of a shepherd and sheep is anything but easy, romantic, or pretty. It was ugly. Right? Shepherds are rough around the edges. Sheep are loud and unruly. Sheep get lost without constant, vigilant care of their shepherd. For Jesus to say, "I am the good shepherd and you are the sheep," would have been an affront to the elite and educated people of his time, much as it is today. The wealthy and privileged people of Jesus' time were, for the most part, not ready to sacrifice their wealth and privilege, not ready to give their money away to those in need as a spiritual practice or otherwise. So the sheep, the followers of Jesus, particularly in the beginning, were a ragtag group of outsiders made up of a lot of people who would not have been considered acceptable to the more respectable people of Jerusalem. Yet even these folks had to be reminded that they weren't the only members. Even you ragtag folks, you're not the only members of the flock. Which brings us to another important part of Jesus' lesson in today's text, one that's particularly important for our church tradition, which is that God's flock is an inclusive one. Jesus says, "I have other sheep that do not belong to this fold. I must bring them also, so there'll be one flock and one shepherd." This verse reminds us that we don't control God, that we don't decide who are the sheep or who are the followers of Christ's example. Jesus teaches us that there are people who follow Christ's teachings, people who Jesus knows, but that we're totally unaware of because they're not in the same flock as us. So who are these other sheep that Jesus mentions? Well, when this sentence was written to the original audience of this text, the people understood it to be the pagans, the non-Jews, the people who are not the chosen ones, those are the other sheep. Is that still true today? Who are these other sheep? Who would those be in today's world? Who are the sheep that Jesus knows that are in another fold, in another flock today? Are there any? I think this passage tells us that we should remain open to the reality that Jesus talks to others who are outside of the flock as we know it. Does this leave the door open to people who practice other religions, such as Jews, Muslims, or Hindus? I don't know. But I do know that that's not our call. Right? That's not our decision. That's not a judgment that we can or should make. Assuming that those who we look down on, those who are outside of the fold, are less than us, are not as privileged, are not as close to God as we are, leads to marginalization, to rejection, to everything but love for neighbor. Treating others as outsiders is rarely love. Based on everything we know from the Bible, Christ is far more inclusive, more loving, less judgmental than we are. So we need to be careful about judging and rejecting others, about suggesting that other people are not part of Christ's plan of love and inclusion, including those who have never heard of Christ as we know him. Humans have a long history of seeing others as outside the flock, and that includes us. When our church, St. John's UCC, crafted our open and affirming policy, we included every category of other sheep we could think of. We included race, because people of other races have sometimes been seen as outside of the flock. We included all age groups, family structures, and abilities. To this day, there are churches who see LGBT people as outside of the flock. We do not. We specifically include gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation as part of Christ's flock, at least here at our church. As a church, we have chosen the path of inclusion and non-judgmental love and strive to understand all of God's creation as part of Christ's one flock. Our job as a church is to follow Christ as closely as we can, yes, like sheep, and to teach others the way of Christ or the way of love. Sacrificing our building and our money so people could have shelter out of the cold and food for the hungry, these are sacrifices of love that you all take part in. Now, if it ever turns out that we're wrong, and we could be, right? If we love too much, if we accept someone that maybe we shouldn't have, we do so out of love and trust that God will heal, that God will transform, and that God will forgive. As part of our church tradition, we assume and we accept that the voice of the shepherd cries out to others just as it cries out to us. And when we fail to accept those who want to follow Jesus Christ out of our own discomfort or our own limited understanding, we run the risk of rejecting someone who's precious to God. Jesus says, I know my own, and my own know me. Our place is not to condemn those who we see as outsiders, but to learn as individuals and as a community to hear the shepherd's voice. There are so many voices out there competing for our attention, for our allegiance. There are many distractions along the way, many voices that are important and others that are not. But Jesus shows us the way. We are called to give of ourselves, to sacrifice for the good of those in need, not to judge, not to condemn, not to reject. And all I can say from all is thank you. Thank you for being part of Christ's flock as we continue to work together to love all of God's creation, no matter if they're in our flock or not, because that's what was demonstrated by Jesus Christ himself.